Hey guys, how are you doing? Welcome to the 8th video of the Golang Ecommerce project backend series. Now, we've started working on our routes, we have started working on our controllers and our database functions and models. Now, routes are almost complete, and we were working on our controllers and all these functions. So from the routes, the command goes to, as in the routes call the controller functions, the control functions call the database level functions. So this means, I'll give you an example that if there are some cart level routes, like let's say add something to cart, then that will begin from the routes, and that route function will call a function in our controllers somewhere here, like let's say add to cart. This add to cart function will call a database function, which is add product to cart. So all these functions have a 1:1 relationship, and this is how the control flows through this entire program. Now, we were working on our controllers file, sign up and login. But in this video, I want to start working on the controller programs or functions for our cart. So that means add to cart, remove item from cart, get item from cart, all those different functions. Because eventually I want to start writing the database level functions for MongoDB, and in the sense how Golang will talk with MongoDB, those database level functions here in the cart.go in the database package file. Okay, so here, so I think there's a mistake. This should be a part of package database. Right, because all the files in a folder, let's say the folder is called database, that'll be the name of the package. And all the files in that folder will all have the same package, so that when you want to access files from that database, from that package, all you have to do is say database dot, and you can access this function. And these are the functions that we'll be accessing in our controllers. In our controllers, cart.go, those are the functions. Like let's say if I am doing something to do with add to cart, here I'll be calling the database dot add to cart function. I hope that makes sense. So now I want to get started with my cart.go file in my controllers. I'll import a couple of things that I know I'll use. Just the common things, like I know I'll use the time package. I will definitely need context, because I want to do something with the database or run some database queries, and I will have an errors. I'll have log in different line. Then I will have net/http. I'll need a couple more, like gin and all those packages, bson and primitive. But let me just leave this here, and let me import all the other ones later on. Before I start working with these functions, I want to create a variable called application that is of type struct. Now, all I'm doing here is I'm just defining two different type of collections. So in our project, there will be two types of collections. Right, so if you know the basics of MongoDB, you know that it stores data not in tables but in something called as collections, which are kind of like tables. So you have a product table or a collection, so like that means a product collection, right? And you have a user collection. So in an SQL terms, if you're not familiar with MongoDB, in an SQL term it would mean that you have a product table and a user table, which are some completely separate things. So you're storing products in a product table and users in a user table. In the context of MongoDB, which is a NoSQL database, it's product collection and user collection. So with the help of application, I want to be able to access those two collections. So I'll say prod collection. By the way, structs, in case you're not familiar with structs, these are basically your own data types that you can define in MongoDB in Golang. So this is your prod collection. This is your user collection. Mongo.collection. All right. Now, once you create a struct, you also need a function to be able to create a new application or a new struct. So we'll say func new application, which basically returns a new struct, and it takes prod collection, it takes user collection, which are both mongo.collection, and it returns an application, which is this. It basically returns this kind of a struct, which will have product collection and user collection variables. And what do you want to return? You don't want to return an application, because obviously that's what we're saying. We're going to return an application, right? And that's what we're returning. We're returning the application here. And the application has two things. You already know, because you've defined the struct here. So the application has two things. One is the prod collection which will be equal to prod collection that you'll receive here in this function. So it just receives these two variables and it creates this nice little struct for us, this whole function, and it returns to us. Okay. And you have your user collection. User collection. Without this function, it won't be possible for us to initialize an application struct, which will have a product and user collection. Okay. Now we'll start working with our add to cart function. Now the most important thing here is that this add to cart function is not just a regular function, it is a struct method. And the struct that we've just defined here, that's what is the struct, the underlying struct for the struct method. In case you don't know about struct methods, I highly recommend you do the basics of Golang. You go through the Golang tour, and then you learn the basics, and then you'll understand about structs and struct methods. So here you'll say return. Now that you know that it returns a gen.handler, so that means it's a function that it's going to return. What does the function take? It takes C, which is gen.context, sorry. And this entire function is basically what's getting returned here. And when we say gen.handler, this entire function add to cart is returning this entire function. Okay. Now there are 2 to 3 things that I want to do in this function. One is when you add something to the cart, you need to have a user, right? The user who's adding something to the cart. And that something is the product. So you need the user ID of the user who's adding that item to the cart, and you need the product ID of the product that's being added to this user's cart. So these 2 things are required. At the same time, you also want to check if the product ID was genuine or not. So we'll use the primitive library to check that. And then at the end, we want to run the database level function, which will add this item to that user's cart. And for that, the database function, we'll call the function that we are yet to write in one of the future videos. We'll write that function. So that'll be in our cart.go file in the database package. And that's the function that we want to call from this function. Okay. So let's start with product query.id. So like I said, you will first check if the product ID is there, because you need the product ID, you need the user ID, because that's how you will add something to that user's cart. So first you want to check if that's even there. So firstly, let's get the ID of the product into a variable called product user product query ID, and let's check if it's empty or not. So let's check product query ID is empty. And you want to say log.println product ID is empty. Okay. But you also want to abort the program. So you'll say abort with error. Stop the program here. http.status bad request, errors.new. Product ID is empty. So you cannot just add something to the cart without passing a product ID, right? You have to pass product ID. And I want to make this equal to a blank character because I don't actually want to use anything that's being returned from this function. So that part is done. Now, similarly, you also want to check for the user ID. So you'll say user query ID, which will be equal to c.query, and which will be equal to user ID. So here, instead of using ID, you could use product ID, but I'm just using ID here. If you want more clarity, you can use product ID instead of just ID. And similarly, we'll check if user query ID is equal to a blank string and log.println user ID is empty. And we again want to c.abort with errors, similar thing, and user ID is empty. User in double quotes, obviously user ID is empty. And you want to just capture that in a empty blank character, blank variable. Sorry. Now, if obviously if this issue is there, then you want to just return from this function. Now, like I said, you want to check if the product ID, let's say the product ID was received, it was not empty. It was received, it needs to be genuine, right? So let's check that. So we'll use the primitive dot object ID. We've used this function many times, this package many times, this function many times in all the other video series that I've done. So in case you don't know about it, you can read the documentation from the primitive package. So here we're checking if the product ID is genuine or not, is acceptable to us or not. And this primitive, you get that from your Mongo driver. So let's get the MongoDB packages. First, let me get the gin connect/gin. Oops. Then I'll get the GitHub, sorry, go.mongodb.org/mongodriver/json. Then I'll get go.mongodb.org/mongodriver/json/primitive. And this is the package that we want right now. But I'll also get the regular Mongo package. So I'll say mongodb.org/mongodriver/mongo. Okay. It'll give me squiggly lines obviously here because I've not imported these packages. So we'll run go.mod_id soon to get those packages. So once you do this, right, you want to check for the error. So if error is not equal to nil, print ln error, and you want to abort with status http://status internal server error return. So now that everything is all right and you have received the actual product ID right from the hex, and you have checked if it's if it's all right or not, and you have also handled the error, now you can run the database level function. So to run the database level function, you obviously have to pass context and timeout because you don't want this to block the entire program, right? Because with MongoDB there can be issues. So you want to say context/cancel context.with timeout context.background. Give it 5 seconds. So this is where I'm using the time package, and this bracket that I've closed here by mistake is supposed to get closed out here at the end. And we'll defer cancel. Now comes the most important part of this entire function, which is calling the function which we have not written yet in the cart.go, the database package, which will be there in the cart.go file. So let's write that function. So that function, I can access that using the database package. So let's say database dot and add product to cart. Now you need to make sure that this function, this is why I wrote the scaffolding or the empty functions here. So that when I'm writing it here, when I'm trying to call that function here, VS Code gives me an autocomplete, right? This is why I wrote it here, so that this function and the function that I'm calling here, they match. If I end up calling some other function with some little typo or spelling mistake, then it'll be a problem, because then this function won't get called and the program won't really work as intended. So you need to tell the database level function that you want to perform this query or this operation, which is add product to cart in the using the product collection and also the user collection. So you'll see user collection, product ID needs to be passed, and user query ID needs to be passed. This is why we checked for the product ID and user query ID if they're not empty. Only if they're there, we can pass it in this function. And you can check for errors. So we'll say if error is not equal to nil, you want to say indented JSON http.status internal server error, error. If all went well, if there was no issues, then you want to again send, instead of status OK, I'll say just 200 directly, and I'll say successfully added to the cart. So this was our add to cart function. So in this video, we have imported a couple of files. We have written our struct for application, our function for creating a new application struct which returns an application. We have created our add to cart function, which checks for product ID, checks for user query, and it also runs a database function, calls a database function that we will be writing soon. And it basically adds something to the cart, a product to the user's cart. So let's go ahead and save this. And in the next video, we'll continue with this, this file itself. And then for each of these functions, we'll create a function in database package cart.go. Okay. So usually what I also do is sometimes what I also do is that I create the controller function, then I create the database level function just to show you the 1:1 mapping so that you come to know that this function that I'm calling in the database package, this is what it looks like. But I think here in this case, what I'll do is I'll just quickly finish these. I think I saw a spelling mistake here. What I'll do is I'll quickly finish these functions off from here, and then all the functions that are being called from the database package, we'll work on them separately. So I hope that approach also works for you. Thank you for watching. Do subscribe to this channel so that you come to know when the next video of this series comes out, which will be very soon. And thank you for watching. See you.